In the name of our loving and liberating and life-giving God, amen. Greetings and welcome on this dreary Sunday. It's good to see all of you in church this morning. When I was in middle school, a trend started to emerge among Christian kids. You might have heard about it or seen it. It was the famed WWJD bracelet. Anyone? Have you ever had one? Known someone who's had one? What does WWJD stand for? What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? So in my experience of being a part of that group of young people who wore those bracelets throughout middle school, the WWJD often stood for don't do anything wrong, right? Don't do anything out of order. Don't do anything that you shouldn't be doing. Don't break the rules. That bracelet most often sort of reminded us to keep our behavior within the bounds of authority. Well, when we think about what would Jesus do in relationship to the gospel stories, it actually often seems like what would Jesus do is to push those bounds of authority, to do things that are considered out of order, or at least out of the norm, particularly among the religious institutions and religious leaders of the time. And ultimately, we know that what happens in Jesus' life is that pushing those norms and boundaries gets Jesus in a lot of trouble. In today's gospel, we see Jesus pushing some boundaries. We're only 21 verses, not chapters, verses into Mark's gospel, and Jesus is already walking into a synagogue and teaching as one in authority. Not only is it the Sabbath and Jesus is about to do something, a healing of sorts, that you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath, but he also walks into the synagogue and begins teaching as if he is one of the rabbis. Imagine if someone walked through these doors this morning and said, "Excuse me, Amelia, I'm actually here to preach." What would we do? I'm not really sure. It's never happened. But that's what Jesus did. He walked into the synagogue on the Sabbath and began teaching. That's why his followers, his disciples, were amazed. And in the synagogue, there was a man with an unclean spirit, and Jesus recognized that unclean spirit. He recognized that this man needed healing, and so without anything more than words, Jesus commands this unclean spirit to leave this man's body. He heals him, he exorcises him of this demon, and again, he pushes the boundaries of authority by performing that sort of healing not only on the Sabbath, but in the synagogue. Imagine if we had some rule about what we were allowed to do on Sundays, and not only did someone come in here and do it, but to do something you're not allowed to do in the place that's telling you you're not allowed to do it. That changes the meaning of that WWJD a little bit, doesn't it? I mean, for me it does. Another way of talking about what Jesus did in today's gospel story is that Jesus used his authority to call out that which wasn't right in the world. This unclean spirit inhabiting a man was not the way that God created the world to be. Yesterday, about 120 people from multiple different churches gathered at the Bird Theater, and we watched a documentary and celebrated the Philadelphia 11. The Philadelphia 11 were the first 11 women who were ordained in the Episcopal Church, and they were ordained out of order. They answered the WWJD in a way that actually looks a lot like Jesus. They felt called to be priests at a time when the church did not affirm that women could in fact serve as priests or bishops. But they listened to God's call in their lives, and they organized themselves. They prayed, they discerned, they were thoughtful. They gathered folks around them who also agreed that women should be in fact allowed to be priests. And they organized themselves in such a way that they found 3 bishops who were willing to ordain them, even though at that time the church was saying women can't be ordained. Just like there was a lot of pushback in Jesus' ministry about doing things that he shouldn't be doing according to the religious institution, the plight of the Philadelphia 11 after their ordinations was that they received a lot of pushback. Many of them were not able to even find full-time jobs in ministry, and it took many, many years for them to be accepted as fully participating ordained members of the church. But what they started was a turn in the church's theology. What they started was a turn in the church towards what I believe, as a woman who's ordained, was God's intended purpose for us. That whether male or female, God calls certain folks to preach the gospel. So these brave women took it upon themselves to listen to what God was calling them to do. They answered the call of what would Jesus do in a way that pushed the boundaries of the church, but towards that intended creation that God believes in for us. When we answer the what would Jesus do in our lives, we are called to do that same sort of thoughtful, discerned work. We are called to identify and push back against the things that we know aren't right in the world. Anyone who is alive, who walks around on this planet, I'm sure is able to see that there are things that aren't quite right, that there are things that are out of order in terms of the way that God might imagine the world to be for us. And we are called to be people who thoughtfully push the boundaries so that the right order might begin to take place. It's not my job to tell you what those things are for you in your lives, but it is my job to tell you that you are called to do that work. That as a Christian, to answer the what would Jesus do call in our lives, it means we're supposed to push the boundaries just a little bit. I don't think we're supposed to upset the apple cart so much that we lose that we sort of lose the momentum, or that we lose the respect, or that we lose the support of those around us. But we're called to do that work thoughtfully and in conversation with God and one another. So may we, like the Philadelphia 11 and like Jesus, have the courage to call out that which is not right in the world and to help change it for the better, so that we might all participate in creating a world that God imagines for us. Amen.